The wind had a name out here, but no one was left to speak it. It was a dry, rasping thing, the sound of 1,000 forgotten ghosts scouring the sand from bleached bones. It had been Sarah Layton's only companion for days, a constant, abrasive whisper against the cracked skin of her face. It promised water where there was only shimmering heat and rest where there was only the long, slow march toward another horizon that looked exactly like the last. Sarah walked with the steady, energy-saving gait of a creature who understood that every calorie was a coin to be spent wisely. Her world had been stripped down to its barest essentials. The sun above was a merciless god of fire and light. The earth below was a cracked, ochre-colored anvil. In her right hand, she carried the weight that defined her, a heavy, black cast-iron skillet, its handle wrapped in a scrap of leather to keep from burning her palm. In her left, clutched tight to her chest as if it were a beating heart, was a small deerskin pouch. The skillet was for survival. The pouch was for living. Hunger was no longer a pang. It was a permanent state of being, a cold, hollow space inside her where fear and hope had long ago shriveled into something small and hard. It made the world tilt and shimmer. It made her thoughts slow and thick, like molasses in winter. But it had not yet defeated her. As long as she had the skillet and the pouch, it would not. She stumbled into what was left of the town of Redemption just as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the desolate landscape in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Redemption. The name was a cruel joke, etched on a splintered sign that swung from a single rusty hinge, groaning with every gust of wind. The town was a skeleton. Buildings stood with hollow eyes where windows had once been, their wooden bones picked clean by sun and sand. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, all gaping mouths open in a silent scream. This was a place where dreams had come to die. For Sarah, it was a place to cook. She made her way to the center of the town, a wide, dusty square where a gallows stood stark against the fading light, a monument to the only kind of justice this land seemed to offer. In its shadow, she found the town well. The rope was frayed, the bucket gone, but by tying her own length of cord to a small tin pot, she managed to draw up a few inches of murky, metallic-tasting water. It was more precious than gold. With the patience of a saint, she gathered scraps of dry, silvered wood from the remains of a collapsed porch, brittle tinder, a few thicker pieces. She arranged them in the middle of the square, a tiny altar in a vast, empty cathedral of dust. She struck a match, one of only 7 she had left, and cupped her hands around the tiny flame, protecting it from the wind's greedy fingers. The smoke that rose was thin and gray, a fragile prayer sent up into the indifferent twilight. Once the fire was steady, a small circle of warmth and defiance in the encroaching cold of the desert night. She set her skillet over the flames to heat. Then, with reverent hands, she opened the deerskin pouch. The scent that wafted out was the ghost of another life. It was the smell of her mother's kitchen, a warm, safe place that now existed only in the fragile architecture of memory. Cumin, earthy and deep, dried oregano, a whisper of sun-drenched hillsides, smoked chili powder, carrying a gentle fire, a single, precious bay leaf. These were the last remnants of her inheritance, the only legacy passed down from a woman whose hands had been as worn as the leather of the pouch itself. Her mother had told her, "Food is more than fuel. Sarah, it's memory, it's love. With the right spices, you can make a feast from almost nothing. You can remind a man of his mother. You can make a stranger feel like he's home." Sarah's supplies were meager, a handful of hard pinto beans, saved from her last meager trade weeks ago. She poured them into the skillet with a splash of her precious water. They hissed as they hit the hot iron. She added a pinch of salt, a dusting of cumin and chili. She stirred them with a wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth and dark from years of use. The aroma began to fill the square. It was a simple, honest smell, the smell of beans and chili and wood smoke. But in the dead heart of Redemption, it was the smell of life itself, It pushed back against the desolation, a declaration that even here, in a place forgotten by God and man, a woman was making a meal. She was not just surviving. She was creating a small moment of comfort, a ritual of civilization against the encroaching wild. She ate slowly, deliberately, making each bean last. It was not a feast, but it was enough. It quieted the gnawing in her belly and, for a moment, the ache in her soul. She was cleaning the skillet with a handful of sand when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her hand instinctively tightening on the skillet's handle, ready to swing it as a weapon. An old man stood there, silhouetted against the last of the light. He was as weathered as the landscape, his face a roadmap of deep lines carved by sun and time. He wore dusty trousers, a simple shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. He didn't look like a threat, but out here, everything was a threat until proven otherwise. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply breathing in the air. When he finally did, his voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "That's a smell I ain't smelled in this town for 20 years. Sarah said nothing. She remained crouched by her fire, her body tense, watching him. The man took a slow step closer, his hands held out at his sides, open and empty. "That ain't just the smell of beans, girl. That's the smell of a kitchen. There's a difference." He nodded toward her deerskin pouch. "You got a knowing hand with the spice." Still, she was silent. Trust was a currency she could no longer afford. The old man seemed to understand. He didn't press, he just stood there, a quiet, patient presence. "My name is Don Silvano," he said, as if that should mean something. "I was just passing through, on my way north. Thought I'd rest my bones in a place where the ghosts are too tired to holler." He gestured with his chin toward her nearly empty skillet. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to part with a spoonful of that memory you cooked up I can pay? Got a bit of jerky?" Sarah considered him. His eyes, now visible in the firelight, were clear and tired, not clouded with malice or drink. There was a deep sadness in them, but also a simple decency. Slowly, she scraped the last few beans from the pan onto a tin plate she carried and held it out to him. "Keep your jerky," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Food's meant to be shared." Don Silvano took the plate with a nod of thanks. He ate as she had, slowly and with appreciation. When he was done, he looked at the clean plate, then back at her. "My wife," he said softly, his voice catching on the words. "She made beans just like this, made a man feel like he had a hearth to come home to, even when all we had was a campfire. She's been gone 10 years. He looked at Sarah, truly seeing her for the first time, not just a piece of driftwood washed up in a dead town, but a person. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the fierce pride in the set of her jaw, and the deep, old sorrow in her young eyes. "A woman who can cook like that," he said, his voice gaining a new strength. "She don't belong in a place like this. This is where things end. You're about beginnings." Sarah gave a short, bitter laugh. "Beginnings are long past for me. Old man, I'm just trying to find an ending that's warm and has a full belly." "No," he insisted, shaking his head. "The world is hard. Yes, it grinds you down. But a skill like yours, that's a rock the world can't grind away. It's real. It's valuable." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes earnest. "I know a place, a ranch. It's called Rancho El Mado. It's run by a man named Ignacio Ramirez." The name meant nothing to Sarah. "He's a hard man," Don Silvano continued, his voice low and serious. "Hard as January ice. He don't say 2 words when one will do. Some say he's got no heart left in him. But he's fair, and he runs the biggest ranch in this territory. He's got men to feed, men who are tired of salted beef and dry biscuits. They eat, but they don't dine. They're fed, but they ain't nourished." He paused, letting his words sink in. A man like that, he understands value. He might not have a heart, but he knows what a good meal is worth. He knows what it does for the spirit of his men. It's a long shot, girl. He might turn you away without a word. but it's a better chance than waiting for the wind to bury you here." Sarah looked around the dead square, the gallows, the empty windows, the suffocating silence. The old man was right. This was an ending. Any direction she chose from here had to be a beginning of some sort, even if it was just the beginning of her final journey. She looked at her skillet, black and solid in the firelight. She clutched the spice pouch, its worn leather soft against her fingers. They were all she had. They were who she was. "Where is this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A slow smile spread across Don Silvano's weathered face. It was the first real expression of warmth she had seen in months, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. 2 days' walk north of here," he said, pointing into the darkness. "I'm heading that way myself. Not to the ranch, but past it. I can show you the road. After that, you're on your own." She stared into the fire, the small flames dancing. For the first time in a long while, a tiny flicker of something that wasn't just the will to survive ignited within her. It wasn't quite hope. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing that could be too easily crushed. This was something harder, more practical. It was purpose, the idea that her skillet and her spices, the legacy of her mother, might be worth something more than just keeping her alive for one more day. They might be worth a place at a table, a roof over her head. A beginning. She nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. "All right, old man," she said, her voice finding a sliver of its lost strength. "Lead the way." As Don Silvano settled down to sleep on the other side of the dying fire, Sarah Layton held her mother's spice pouch to her nose one last time, breathing in the scent of cumin, chili, and a past she could never reclaim. But now, mixed with that scent of memory, was the faint, unfamiliar aroma of a future she might just be able to build. Don Silvano left her at a fork in the dusty road just after sunrise on the second day. The air was cool and carried the scent of sage. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the northern path, which seemed to climb into a series of low, rolling hills. "Rancho El Mado lies that way," he said, his voice quiet in the vast morning silence. "You'll see the fences before you see the house. They stretch for miles. You can't miss it." He handed her a small piece of dried apple and a water skin that was still half full. "This is where I leave you. Girl, may your skillet be heavy and your spices find favor." Sarah took the offered provisions with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Don Silvano, for everything." "I did nothing," he said, tipping his hat. "It was the smell of your cooking that opened the door. Remember that." He turned and shuffled down the southern path without looking back. A small, weathered figure soon swallowed by the immensity of the land. She was alone again, but it was a different kind of alone. Before, it had been the loneliness of aimless despair. Now, it was the sharp, focused solitude of a mission. She had a destination. She had a chance, however slim. She adjusted the skillet in her hand, clutched the spice pouch, and started walking north. As the old man had promised, the character of the land began to change within hours. The wild, untamed desert gave way to something managed, something owned. A fence appeared, a simple line of 3 taut wires strung between sturdy wooden posts, stretching from horizon to horizon. It was a declaration of dominion, a line drawn in the dust separating the world of Ignacio Ramirez from everything else. The fence ran alongside the road for what felt like an eternity, a constant reminder that she was now treading on a king's land. By late afternoon, she saw it, nestled in a shallow valley, protected by a stand of ancient, broad-limbed elm trees that gave the ranch its name, was a collection of buildings. They were not the haphazard, desperate structures of a place like Redemption. These were solid, deliberate constructions of adobe and dark timber. A sprawling main house with a long, shaded veranda sat at the center, an overseer watching its domain. Surrounding it were long, low bunkhouses, a massive barn, corrals teeming with horses, and the unmistakable shape of a blacksmith's forge. its chimney sending a lazy curl of smoke into the clear blue sky. The entire ranch was a testament to order and power. It was an empire carved out of the wilderness, and it pulsed with a quiet, efficient energy. The sight of it was both awe-inspiring and deeply intimidating. This was not a place one simply wandered into. This was a fortress. Her steps slowed as she approached the main entrance. The fence gave way to a high adobe wall, and set within it was a gate of heavy, black wrought iron. It was a formidable barrier, intricate and severe, topped with sharp, fleur-de-lis-like spikes. An archway of timber rose above it, and burned deep into the wood were two words, Rancho El Mado. The gate was closed. Sarah stopped before it, a dusty, ragged figure suddenly and painfully aware of her own insignificance. She was a stray dog at the door of a palace. The sounds of the ranch, the nickering of horses, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil, the distant shouts of men working cattle seemed to come from another world. She stood in the hot sun, the skillet feeling impossibly heavy in her hand, and waited. She didn't know what else to do. Shouting seemed a violation. Rattling the gate felt like an act of insurrection. So she stood, a silent supplicant, hoping to be seen. After a quarter of an hour that felt like a lifetime, a rider approached from inside. He was a young vaquero, lean and hard, his face shaded by the brim of his hat. He reined in his horse just inside the gate, looking down at her with open suspicion. His eyes took in her tattered dress, the dirt on her face, the desperation she knew she couldn't hide. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat and unwelcoming. "I'm here to see Mr. Ramirez," Sarah said, her voice raspy. The man's mouth tightened. He almost laughed. "The boss don't see drifters." It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the position of the sun. "I'm not a drifter," she said, forcing a strength into her words that she didn't feel. "I'm a cook." The vaquero's gaze dropped to the skillet in her hand, then to the worn pouch clutched at her chest. He still looked unconvinced, but the word cook had planted a seed of something other than outright dismissal. He hesitated for a moment, then grunted, "Wait here." He wheeled his horse around and cantered toward the main house, leaving her alone again in the dust and the silence. The wait that followed was a form of torture. The sun beat down, and the shadow of the gate's iron spikes fell across her like the bars of a cage. Every minute that passed felt like a small death, another grain of her fragile resolve worn away. She could feel unseen eyes on her from the bunkhouse, from the barn. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the ranch's rigid order. She thought about turning back, but there was nothing to turn back to. Behind her was redemption and the endless, hungry desert. Before her was this gate and the slimmest sliver of a chance. Finally, the wide, dark wood door of the main house opened. A man stepped out onto the veranda. Even at a distance, his presence was absolute. He did not hurry. He moved with a kind of lethal economy, each step deliberate and sure. As he drew closer, the low hum of activity on the ranch seemed to falter. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Men in the corrals paused, their hands still. All attention was drawn to him, a silent, instinctual deference. This was Ignacio Ramirez. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his simple, dark shirt. He wore no gun belt, no flashy adornments. His authority was not something he needed to wear. It was something he was. His face was weathered by the same sun that had cracked the land. But where the land was brittle, he was granite. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, when he finally stopped a few feet from the gate, were the color of a storm-darkened sky. They were cold, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. He did not speak. He simply looked at her. His gaze was not a glance. It was an inventory. It moved from her worn-out boots to the frayed hem of her dress, lingered on the skillet as if weighing it, and finally settled on her face. In that long, silent moment, Sarah felt herself being measured, assessed, and found wanting. She felt like a scrawny calf being inspected for slaughter. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and devoid of any emotion. It was the sound of gravel grinding against stone. "We give nothing away here." It was a dismissal, a verdict. She was, in his eyes, another beggar looking for a handout. The finality in his tone was like a physical blow. Her throat went dry. All the words she had practiced, all the courage she had tried to summon, threatened to dissolve into dust. She looked at his impassive, hard face and saw no mercy, no charity, no hope. But then she remembered her mother's hands, the smell of cumin, and Don Silvano's quiet encouragement. It was the smell of your cooking that opened the door. She was more than a beggar. She had something of value. It was the only thing she had. She took a shaky breath, meeting his cold gaze directly. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. "I'm not asking for a gift, sir," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden stillness. She clutched the deerskin pouch tighter, its worn leather a familiar comfort against her hammering heart. She saw a flicker of impatience in his eyes, the beginning of a turn, a final rejection. It had to be now. "I know I'm not worth much," she whispered, the words a raw, honest confession of her desperate state. The humility hung in the air, stark and undisguised. She saw his jaw tighten, his mind already moving on. She pushed the last of her words out, a final, desperate cast of a line into a deep, dark ocean. "But I can cook." The words were simple. They were the truest thing about her. They were not a plea, but a statement, a declaration of the one skill, the one piece of herself that the world had not yet managed to take. Ignacio Ramirez stopped. He had been about to turn away. The matter concluded, but he stopped. His dark eyes, which had been looking through her, now focused on her. For the first time, he seemed to actually see her. He saw the desperation, yes, but he also saw the flicker of defiance behind it. He saw the truth in her statement. Silence descended again, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of consideration. His gaze dropped from her eyes to the skillet, then to the pouch, and back to her face. He was a rancher. He understood assets. He understood tools. He understood value. Not in terms of sentiment, but in terms of function. A good horse had value. A strong fence had value. A loyal man had value. Did a cook? He weighed her words against the reality of his ranch, the endless cycle of beef and beans, the grumbling of men tired of the same tasteless fare, the simple, practical matter of morale. He was a businessman running an army, and an army, as the saying went, marched on its stomach. He showed none of this on his face. His expression remained a mask of cold neutrality. But his mind was working, calculating odds, assessing risks. Taking in a stray was a risk, but the potential reward, a decent meal, could make men work harder, complain less, feel more like a community and less like a pack of hired hands. After what felt like an age, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod, not to her, but to himself, as if coming to a conclusion in a silent negotiation. He turned his head slightly toward the vaquero, who had been watching the entire exchange, frozen in his saddle. "Show her the cookhouse," Ignacio commanded. The words were not an invitation. They were an order. Then he turned his gaze back to Sarah, his eyes as cold and hard as before. There was no welcome in them, no kindness. There was only the stark, unyielding nature of a challenge. "The men eat when the sun touches that western ridge," he said, his voice flat and final. "There will be 10 of them. Cook for them." And with that, he turned his back on her and walked toward the house, his posture ramrod straight, his steps as measured and certain as before. He did not look back. The audience was over. The young vaquero dismounted and, with a look of grudging disbelief, moved to the gate. With a loud groan of metal on metal, he swung the heavy iron barrier open just wide enough for her to pass. Sarah Layton took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and horses and a terrifying, fragile opportunity. She shifted the skillet in her grip, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out of the blinding sun of the wilderness and into the deep, cool shadow of Rancho El Mado. The gate closed behind her with the solid, final thud of a vault door. She was in, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real test had just begun. The vaquero. Leo grunted and jerked his chin toward a long, low building set back from the bunkhouses. "Cookhouse is there." He walked with a bow-legged swagger, the jingling of his spurs the only sound accompanying their footsteps. He did not offer to carry her skillet. The cookhouse door opened with a long, mournful creak. The air that rushed out was stale and thick with the ghosts of 1,000 joyless meals, old grease, burnt coffee, the faint, sour smell of spoiled flour. The room was cavernous, its ceiling lost in a web of shadows. A colossal black iron stove, a monstrous beast of a thing, dominated one wall. Along the others were long, scarred wooden tables, benches, and shelves stacked high with provisions in sacks and tins. It was a space built for function, not comfort, and it felt as though it hadn't known a woman's touch, or indeed any touch of care, in a very long time. Leo pointed with a grimy finger. "Stove, pantry's through there. Water pump is out the back door. The boss wasn't joking. Sun hits that ridge." He gestured with his head toward the high western window. "They'll be here, all of them." He looked her up and down one last time, a mixture of pity and skepticism on his young, hard face. Then he turned and left, the creak of the door sealing her inside. Sarah stood alone in the sudden, heavy silence. This was her proving ground. The stove was a cold altar, the pantry a barren offering. For a moment, the sheer scale of the task threatened to crush her. Cooking for herself from a handful of beans was one thing. Cooking for 10 hungry, hard-working men in a strange kitchen with unknown supplies was another entirely. She set her skillet down on the table with a solid thud. The familiar weight of it seemed to anchor her. She took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the stale air, and let it out slowly. Then she went to work. The process began not with food, but with fire. The stove's firebox was full of old ash. She cleaned it out with methodical care, her movements precise. She laid a bed of dry kindling, arranged larger pieces of split mesquite on top, and struck one of her precious matches. The flame caught, a tiny orange flower in the darkness. She coaxed it, nurtured it, watched it grow until a satisfying roar filled the stove's iron belly, and a wave of warmth began to push back against the room's chill. It was the first act of transformation, the first assertion of her will upon this neglected space. Next, the pantry. It was, as she'd expected, a testament to bulk and survival. Enormous sacks of pinto beans and flour, smaller sacks of potatoes and onions, a barrel of salt pork, several slabs of salted beef hanging from hooks, tins of coffee, and a large canister of lard. There was nothing fresh, nothing green, nothing that spoke of anything other than grim necessity. But to Sarah, this was a landscape of possibility. She ran a hand over a dusty sack of potatoes. She lifted a hard, yellow onion, its skin like parchment. She saw not what was there, but what could be. She decided against the beans; they would take too long to soak. It had to be a stew, a rich, thick stew that would stick to their ribs, something that tasted of the earth and of slow, careful cooking. She pumped water into a large bucket, the rhythmic squeak of the handle a steady percussion in the quiet room. The water was cold and clear, a blessing. She washed her hands, scrubbing away the dust of the road, and the act felt like a baptism. This was a new beginning, a clean slate. The cooking became a ritual, a silent dance she had performed in her mind 1,000 times. Each movement was deliberate, stripped of wasted effort. She carried a slab of salted beef to the main table and began to trim it, her knife moving with a fluid grace. The hiss of the blade against the meat was a whisper only she could hear. She cut the beef into thick, uniform cubes. She peeled the onions, the sharp scent bringing tears to her eyes. But she did not weep. These were honest tears, the kind that came from work, not sorrow. She diced them into a fine, even snow. She scrubbed the potatoes until their skins were clean and their eyes were gone, then chopped them into hearty chunks. She placed a massive cast-iron cauldron on the stove, slicked its bottom with a scoop of lard, and waited until it shimmered with heat. The beef went in first. The sizzle was explosive. A sudden, violent sound that filled the cookhouse. The smell of searing meat, rich and savory, was the first real, living aroma the room had known in years. She did not crowd the pot, browning the meat in batches, ensuring every piece had a dark, flavorful crust. This was the foundation. This was the first layer of memory. Once the meat was browned and set aside, the onions went into the pot. She cooked them slowly, stirring with her long wooden spoon, until they softened, turned translucent, and released their deep, sweet flavor into the rendered beef fat. Then came the most sacred moment. With reverent hands, she opened her deerskin pouch, the scent of her mother's legacy cumin, chili, oregano wafted into the air, a warm, earthy perfume that mingled with the aroma of the onions and beef. It was the smell of home, the smell of love, the smell of a life she had lost. She measured the spices not with a spoon, but with her fingers and her heart. A pinch of this, a dash of that. She stirred them into the onions, toasting them for a moment to awaken their sleeping oils. The smell in the room deepened, becoming complex and intoxicating. It was no longer just the smell of food. It was the smell of a promise. The meat went back into the pot, followed by the potatoes. She added water from the bucket, enough to cover everything, and stirred it all together. Finally, she dropped in the single precious bay leaf from her pouch, her mother's secret for adding a layer of deep, savory warmth that no one could ever quite name. She placed the heavy lid on the cauldron, adjusted the stove's damper to lower the heat, and stepped back. There was nothing to do now but wait. The stew would take time, a long, slow simmer to tenderize the tough meat and allow the flavors to marry into a harmonious whole. As the stew bubbled gently, its fragrance began to escape the cookhouse. It was a subtle invasion at first, a mere whisper on the breeze, but it grew stronger, rolling across the dusty ranch yard like a silent summons. It slipped into the barn, where men were mending tack. It drifted into the blacksmith's forge, overriding the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. It found its way to the corrals, where the vaqueros were breaking a stubborn colt. Men paused in their work. They lifted their heads, sniffing the air like hunting hounds, their faces, etched with the familiar lines of boredom and fatigue, registered a flicker of confusion, then curiosity. This was not the usual smell of supper. This was something different, something real. Sarah, meanwhile, used the time to make biscuits. She worked quickly, her hands a blur in the flour, her touch light and sure. She mixed flour, lard, salt, and water, kneading the dough just enough to bring it together. She shaped them into round, imperfect discs and placed them on a baking sheet. The sun, a great fiery eye in the sky, began its slow descent, finally touching the sharp line of the western ridge, as if on a silent, shared signal. The sounds of the ranch's labor began to cease. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The shouts from the corral faded. And then they came. The cookhouse door creaked open and they filed in, one by one. 10 of them. They were exactly as she'd imagined, lean, hard men, their faces burned by the sun and caked with the dust of their work. They moved with a kind of weary purpose, their bodies tired but their eyes sharp and watchful. They took in the scene, the warm, fragrant room, the bubbling pot on the stove, and her, the small, quiet woman standing beside it. They said nothing. They moved to a stack of tin plates and cups, the scrape and clatter of metal the only sound. They formed a line. Sarah took a deep breath and lifted the heavy lid from the cauldron. A cloud of fragrant steam billowed into the room. She picked up a ladle and began to serve. She filled each plate with a thick, dark stew, rich with meat and potatoes, and placed 2 golden brown biscuits beside it. She worked in silence, meeting no one's eyes, focusing only on the task. The men took their plates and moved to the long tables, sitting down on the benches. Then came the silence. It was a profound, absolute silence, broken only by the sound of spoons scraping against tin. No one spoke. No one joked or complained as men often do at the end of a long day. They simply ate. They ate with a deep, consuming focus, their heads bent over their plates. They were not just sating hunger. They were tasting. Sarah watched from her place by the stove, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. This was the verdict. This quiet, intense concentration was her jury. She saw a man, his face as weathered as old leather, close his eyes for a moment as he savored a spoonful. She saw another use a piece of his biscuit to meticulously wipe his plate clean, ensuring not a single drop of the rich gravy was wasted. Several of the men got up, returned to the pot, and served themselves a second helping, their movements as silent and deliberate as their first. The meal ended as quietly as it had begun, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion or appraisal. It was a silence of deep, unspoken satisfaction. It was the silence of recognition. Just as the last man was finishing, the door opened again. Ignacio Ramirez stepped inside. The remaining tension in the room solidified. The men, who had begun to relax slightly, straightened up. Ignacio's presence filled the space, his cold, authoritative aura silencing even the scrape of the last spoon. He moved to the pot, served himself a plate of the stew, and sat at the head of the main table. In the seat the other men had instinctively left empty. He ate as he did everything else with a slow, unnerving deliberation. He tasted a spoonful of the stew, his face a granite mask. He broke a piece of biscuit, dipped it in the gravy, and ate it. Sarah felt his judgment with every bite he took. Her entire world had narrowed to this man and this plate of food. He finished his meal, every last bit of it. He placed his spoon neatly on his clean plate and wiped his mouth with a cloth. He let the silence stretch, drawing it out until it was taut as a wire. Finally, he lifted his head and his dark, unreadable eyes found hers across the room. The other men began to discreetly file out, sensing this was a private matter. He did not thank her. He did not praise the food. He simply looked at her, his gaze as penetrating as it had been at the gate, and asked a single, quiet question. "Who have you cooked for before?" The question was not an idle one. It was a demand for her history, her credentials, spoken in the only language he seemed to understand, the language of past performance. Sarah's mind raced. She had no grand reply, no list of prestigious ranches or wealthy families. She had only the truth. "My mother, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart, "and myself." Ignacio held her gaze for another long moment, weighing her simple, honest answer. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A conclusion reached in his silent, internal ledger. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. He turned to Leo, who had lingered by the door, the small room behind the main storeroom. He commanded, his voice as flat and emotionless as ever. "It's empty. Give her a blanket and a lamp." Without another word or another glance in her direction, Ignacio Ramirez strode out of the cookhouse and into the twilight. The trial was over. Leo led her across the yard to a small, windowless door at the back of a large adobe building. The room inside was little more than a closet, smelling of dust and dried herbs. It contained nothing but a narrow cot. It was stark, bare and cold, but it had a door that closed, and it was hers. Leo wordlessly handed her a rough wool blanket and an oil lamp, then left her in the darkness. Sarah lit the lamp, and the small room filled with a soft, flickering glow. She sat on the edge of the cot, the blanket in her lap. She had not been welcomed. She had not been thanked. She had been assigned a post, given rations. But as she closed her eyes, the rich, savory scent of the stew still clinging to her clothes. She knew she had done more than just survive another day. She had earned her place. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew where she would be sleeping tomorrow night. The days at Rancho El Mato settled into a rhythm as stark and unvarying as the landscape itself. Sarah's world was the cookhouse. She rose before the sun, her first act to stoke the embers in the great iron stove, breathing life back into the heart of her small domain. She worked through the day in a solitary, focused ballet of chopping, stirring, and baking. The men would appear at the appointed hours: sunrise, noon, and sunset, like a tide of silent, hungry ghosts. They would file in, take their plates, eat without a word, and disappear back into the world of horses and cattle and dust. She was not mistreated. She was, in a way, respected. Her food was the fuel that ran the ranch's engine, and the men acknowledged its quality with the profound compliment of clean plates and second helpings. But she was an island. No one spoke to her beyond a muttered mornin' or a clipped request for more coffee. She was the cook, a function, a pair of hands that performed a necessary task. She was housed and fed, a far cry from the gnawing hunger of the desert. But a different kind of emptiness had begun to set in. It was the hollow ache of invisibility. She existed, but she was not seen. Then, one morning, something was different. As she unbarred the heavy cookhouse door in the pre-dawn gloom, she saw it, lying on the worn stone step, placed with a care that was utterly foreign to this place, was a small, fragrant sprig of wild oregano. She stopped, her hand on the door, and stared. It was not a weed, accidentally dropped. It was a deliberate offering. The leaves were a dusty green, still fresh, and when she bent to pick it up, the scent that rose to meet her was sharp, clean, and wild. It was the smell of the sun-drenched hills beyond the fences, a world she had only seen from a distance. It was a scent of freedom. She looked around the quiet yard. A few lamps glowed in the bunkhouse, but the ranch was mostly still. Who would have left it? The vaqueros were practical men, concerned with leather and iron and the tempers of half-wild horses. They were not men who dealt in the quiet poetry of herbs. She took the sprig inside, her mind racing. It was a mystery, a tiny, fragrant crack in the monolithic routine of her life. She laid it on the prep table, its wild scent a stark contrast to the domesticated smells of flour and salt pork. All morning, as she worked, her eyes kept returning to it. It was a small thing, a handful of leaves, but it felt like a message from another world. That day she saw him. She had noticed him before, on the periphery. His name, she had learned from overhearing the other men, was Julian. He was one of the ranch hands, but he was different. He was a quiet, slender man who moved with a gentle grace that set him apart from the swaggering confidence of the others. He mostly worked with the horses, his hands as knowing and patient with them as a mother with a child. He never spoke, not because he was sullen, but because he could not. Julian was mute. His silence made him an outsider, just as her gender made her one. He moved along the edges of the ranch's loud, masculine world, a silent observer. She saw him in the corral, his back to her, calming a spooked mare with a soft touch to its muzzle. He did not look in her direction, but she felt, for the first time, a sense of being watched not with suspicion or assessment, but with a quiet, knowing curiosity. That evening, she roasted a slab of salted beef before she put it in the oven. She crushed the leaves of the wild oregano between her fingers and rubbed them into the meat. mixing them with salt and black pepper. The herbs sharp. Resinous aroma filled the cookhouse as it cooked, a new note in the familiar symphony of her kitchen. When the men ate that night, there was the usual silence. No one commented on the new flavor, but Sarah watched from her corner. She saw Julian take his first bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. Then, for just a fraction of a second, his eyes lifted and met hers across the room. There was no smile, no grand gesture. There was only a brief, clear look of acknowledgement. It was a message sent and received. I understood. In that fleeting glance, Sarah felt a connection. A silent thread spun between her kitchen and his quiet world. She was no longer completely alone. The gifts continued. They were never given to her directly, always left on the step before dawn. A series of silent offerings from the world outside the ranch walls. A handful of wild onions, their sharp green stalks a welcome shock of color. A cluster of earthy mushrooms he had found growing in the shade of the elm trees after a rare rain. A small pouch of piñon nuts, their shells painstakingly cracked. Each gift was a new challenge, a new verse in their silent conversation. The wild onions were chopped fine and mixed into her biscuits, giving them a sharp, savory bite. The mushrooms were sliced and simmered in the stew, adding a deep, woodsy flavor that spoke of damp earth and shadowed places. The piñon nuts were toasted and sprinkled over a simple pudding she made from cornmeal and molasses, transforming it from a plain necessity into a rare treat. The men on the ranch never knew the source of these subtle improvements. They only knew that the food, which had started as merely good, was becoming something more. It was becoming interesting. It tasted less of the pantry and more of the land itself. Their silence at the table remained, but it was now laced with a deeper, more profound respect. Sarah, in turn, began to change. The act of cooking was no longer just a job, a way to earn her keep. It was becoming an art again. Julian's gifts were her inspiration. They pushed her to be more creative, to look beyond the sacks of flour and beans and see the possibilities that lay hidden within them. The cookhouse, once a sterile, functional space, began to feel like her own. It was her sanctuary, her studio, her voice. One hot afternoon, she was outside at the pump, refilling her water buckets. When Julian approached, he was leading a lame horse toward the barn, and he stopped at the trough to let it drink. He moved with his usual quiet grace, but she saw that his left hand was wrapped in a bloody rag. She put down her buckets and walked toward him. He saw her coming and tensed slightly, like a wild creature unused to direct contact. She simply pointed to his injured hand. He hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the rag. A long, deep gash ran across his palm, oozing blood. It was a clean cut, likely from a stray piece of wire or a sharp tool, but it was deep. She said nothing. She went back into the cookhouse and returned with a bowl of warm water, a clean cloth, and a small tin of salt. She motioned for him to sit on the edge of the water trough. He watched her, his eyes wide and questioning, but he obeyed. Gently, she took his hand in hers. His skin was calloused and hard from work, but his touch was not rough. She carefully washed the wound with the salt water. He flinched at the sting, but did not pull away. His trust was a fragile, precious thing, and she honored it with the gentleness of her movements. She cleaned the cut, blotted it dry, and then tore a long, clean strip from a spare flour sack to use as a bandage. As she wrapped his hand, her fingers brushing against his, their eyes met again. This time, the look was longer, deeper. His eyes, she saw, were a soft, gentle brown, the color of rich earth. They held no malice, no judgment. In them, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own isolation, but she also saw a quiet strength, an intelligence, and a profound kindness that needed no words to be expressed. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. She finished tying the bandage and released his hand, He stood, took the lame horse's reins, and, with one last soft look at her, continued on his way to the barn. The entire exchange had taken place in complete silence. Not a single word had been spoken, but in those few minutes, a bond that had been forming in shy, secret gestures was solidified. It was an alliance of the quiet ones, a friendship forged in a language of herbs and food and simple, human care. That evening, as Sarah served the men their supper, she no longer felt invisible. She felt the weight of Julian's quiet gaze from his seat at the far end of the table. It was not a possessive or demanding look. It was a look of solidarity. It said, "I see you." She turned back to her stove, a slow warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She picked up her worn wooden spoon, its handle darkened with the memory of 1,000 meals. For the first time since she had walked out of the desert, she felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of a smile. She was not just surviving anymore. She was being seen, and in the silent, hard world of Rancho El Mado. That was everything. The fragile peace Sarah had found was a quiet, delicate thing, nurtured by the silent gifts of herbs and the shared solitude with Julian. Her small room was no longer just a cell. It was a sanctuary. The cookhouse was no longer a testing ground. It was her territory. She had carved out a space for herself in the hard, masculine world of the ranch. A space defined by warmth, skill, and the growing, fragrant cloud of respect that followed her work. But the peace of Rancho El Mado was the peace of a dormant volcano, its tranquility resting upon a deep, hidden core of old sorrows and unspoken tensions. And one Tuesday morning, the ground began to shake. She arrived in a plain black buckboard, drawn by a single, dust-caked black horse. The woman who stepped down from the wagon was as severe and unyielding as the vehicle that carried her. She was dressed entirely in black, a stark, funereal silhouette against the sun-bleached brown of the ranch yard. The fabric of her dress was fine, but old and worn, speaking of a former station that had long since faded. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun, and her face looked as though it had been carved from old, unforgiving wood. She was not Ignacio Ramirez's wife. There was no wife at the ranch. This woman was older, her authority of a different, more ancient vintage. This was Doña Leia, Ignacio's aunt, the matriarch in exile, a ghost of the ranch's past who returned periodically to haunt its present. Her arrival cast an immediate pall over the compound. The usual low hum of activity seemed to quiet. Men tipped their hats as she passed, but their greetings were clipped and their eyes avoided hers. She moved with a slow, stiff-legged gait, leaning on a dark wood cane, and her eyes, small and black as beads of obsidian, missed nothing. They swept over the yard, the bunkhouses, the corrals, and her face was a mask of perpetual disapproval, her mouth a thin, bloodless line, as if she had long ago swallowed every joyful word she might have spoken. Sarah was unaware of the visitor at first, absorbed in her work. She was preparing the noon meal. Julian had left her a particularly fine gift that morning, 2 plump desert sage grouse, their feathers still iridescent in the morning light. It was a rare luxury, a departure from the endless cycle of salted beef and pork. She was determined to do them justice. She was searing the birds in her own skillet, the one she had carried across the desert. When the cookhouse door swung open, the sudden shaft of bright sunlight made her look up, and there, framed in the doorway, stood the woman in black. Doña Leia's presence instantly sucked the warmth from the room. She stood there for a long moment, her dark eyes adjusting to the gloom, taking in the scene with a cold, proprietary air. She saw the relative cleanliness Sarah had brought to the space, the neatly stacked provisions, the scrubbed clean tables. Her gaze did not register approval, but a kind of possessive resentment, as if this tidiness were an affront to her own memory of the place. "So," she said, and her voice was as dry and brittle as autumn leaves, "this is the drifter Ignacio has seen fit to install in my kitchen." It was not a question, it was an indictment. The word "my" hung in the air, sharp as a shard of glass. Sarah's hand froze over the skillet. She felt a prickle of fear, but also a surge of protective anger for the space she had claimed as her own. She said nothing, simply straightened up and met the old woman's gaze. Doña Leia hobbled into the room, her cane thumping a grim rhythm on the wooden floorboards. She ran a gloved finger over a tabletop. It came away clean. Her thin lips tightened further. She moved through the kitchen like a hawk surveying its territory for intruders, her eyes missing no detail. She peered into the flour bin, sniffed at the coffee canister, and finally came to a stop before the stove, where the aroma of the searing grouse was beginning to bloom. "A kitchen girl?" she sniffed, her voice dripping with scorn. "Playing at being a cook. What do you know of feeding real men, you, with your handful of beans and your desert dirt still under your fingernails?" Sarah remained silent. Arguing with this woman would be like arguing with a thunderstorm. She turned her attention back to the birds, carefully turning them in the hot fat. The sizzling sound filled the tense silence. It was the only answer she would give. Her quiet defiance seemed to infuriate the old woman further. "Look at me when I speak to you, girl," Leah snapped. "This place, this kitchen, it has a history. It has standards. It is not some roadside campfire for you to practice your meager skills." As Leah spoke, Sarah reached for her own deerskin pouch. This meal was special. It deserved more than just the basics. She took a pinch of chili powder, a dusting of cumin, but then her fingers brushed against a small, tightly wrapped packet within the pouch. It held the last of her mother's most precious spice blend, a mixture she used only when she wanted to create a taste of pure, unadulterated comfort. It was a warm, fragrant combination of cinnamon, a tiny hint of ground cloves, and the zest of a dried orange peel she had traded for weeks ago. It was a strange combination to some, but one that, when used with a light hand on poultry, created a flavor that was both earthy and bright, a taste of sunshine and warm earth. She sprinkled the delicate, reddish-brown powder over the sizzling birds. The effect on Doña Leia was immediate and profound. As the spices hit the hot fat, they released their full, complex aroma. It was a scent that was unique, unmistakable. The woman froze, her hand halfway to a tin of tea, her head tilted, like an old hawk catching a sound on the wind. She took a step closer to the stove. Her nostrils flared slightly. A flicker of something not anger, but a raw, agonizing confusion passed through her dark eyes. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice losing its sharp edge, becoming a harsh, choked whisper. "That smell. What did you just use?" Sarah did not answer. She continued to cook, spooning the hot fat over the browning skin of the birds. Leah took another unsteady step forward, her face a mask of disbelief. She leaned heavily on her cane, her eyes fixed on the skillet. The aroma was thicker now, filling the room, a scent that for Sarah meant love and memory. But for the old woman, it was clearly something else entirely. It was a key, unlocking a door to a past she had long ago bricked over. "That is my recipe," she breathed, the words laced with a sudden, terrible vulnerability. "Where did you get that? Did you steal it? Did you go through my things?" The accusation was wild, desperate. Her carefully constructed facade of cold disdain was cracking, revealing the raw, wounded woman beneath. "No one has made that dish in this kitchen. No one has used those spices in 15 years, she whispered, her voice trembling. The number hung in the air, a tombstone marking a specific, catastrophic loss. The story was there, in her eyes, a story of a time when this kitchen had been hers, when the scent now filling the air had been the smell of her own hands, of her own joy. A time before the black dress, before the bitterness had settled into the lines of her face like fine, dark dust. She had cooked this for someone she had loved, someone who was gone. Her grief, 15 years old but as fresh as an open wound, turned back into rage. It was easier than the pain. "You have no right," she shrieked, her voice cracking. She raised her cane, its tip trembling with the force of her emotion. You come here from nothing. A stray dog Ignacio took in out of some misguided pity. And you dare to cook my memories in my kitchen? You dare to throw my past in my face? The door to the cookhouse creaked open. It was Julian, his arms loaded with firewood. He stopped dead, his eyes wide, taking in the scene the furious, trembling old woman, and Sarah, standing still and silent before the stove. Sarah finally turned from her cooking. She looked at Doña Leia, and for the first time, she did not see a monster. She saw a woman drowning in a sea of her own sorrow. She saw a pain so deep it had poisoned everything it touched. Sarah's own losses were fresh, sharp, but this woman's grief was a chronic, wasting disease. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself against the accusations of theft. She simply looked into the old woman's furious, heartbroken eyes and spoke the simple truth, her voice quiet but carrying through the tense room. "I'm not trying to steal anything, ma'am," she said softly. "I'm just trying to remind people what warmth tastes like." The words were not an attack. They were not an excuse. They were a statement of purpose, a mission statement for her entire existence. They landed in the charged air with the force of a gentle, undeniable truth. Doña Leia flinched as if she had been struck. The cane lowered. The fury in her eyes guttered, replaced by a vast, empty shock. She stared at Sarah, at this young woman who had endured her own hardships, yet had somehow managed to hold on to the very thing Leah had lost the ability to create comfort, to offer warmth. The girl wasn't mocking her past. She was unknowingly, innocently, resurrecting its most beautiful ghost. The old woman's face crumpled. The hard lines and sharp angles seemed to dissolve, revealing the fragile, ancient grief beneath. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. A dry, rasping sob escaped her throat. Without another word, she turned, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. She stumbled toward the door, pushing past the stunned Julian, her cane clattering against the floorboards. She fled the cookhouse, fled the scent and the memory it had unleashed. A defeated general retreating from a battle she hadn't even known she was fighting. Sarah was left in the sudden, echoing silence, her heart pounding. The rich, beautiful smell of the cooking grouse now seemed tinged with a profound sadness. Julian slowly entered, set the firewood down by the stove, and looked at her, his gentle eyes full of a question he could not ask. She just shook her head slightly, a gesture of weary understanding. She turned back to the meal, her hands moving automatically, but her mind was far away. She now understood that she was not just cooking for hungry men. She was cooking for the ghosts of this ranch, for the deep and hidden sorrows of the people who called it home. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the taste of warmth was a powerful, and sometimes painful, magic. The weeks following the confrontation with Doña Leia settled into a new kind of quiet. The old woman did not return to the cookhouse. She remained a spectral presence in the main house, a thundercloud on the horizon. But she left Sarah's domain alone. The unspoken truce was a fragile thing, but it held. Sarah's silent friendship with Julian deepened, a gentle counterpoint to the ranch's harsh rhythms. His daily offerings from the wild were a constant source of inspiration, a private language that nourished her spirit as much as her cooking nourished the men. She had found a measure of peace. It was a lone rider, appearing out of the shimmering heat of a late afternoon, who brought the past to her doorstep. He was not a ranch hand, but a traveling merchant, his pack mule laden with the small necessities that couldn't be found at the distant general store. As he was concluding his business with Ignacio Ramirez on the veranda, he asked a strange question. "I was told there's a new cook here," the merchant said, his voice raspy with road dust. "A young woman. They say she cooks with a knowing hand." Ignacio, ever taciturn, simply nodded toward the cookhouse. The merchant, a kind-faced man named Elias, made his way to Sarah's door. He held a worn leather satchel in his hands. "Are you the one they call Sarah Layton?" he asked. Sarah, wary of strangers, simply nodded. "I have something for you," he said, fumbling inside his bag. "It was given to me months ago, in a town 2 territories south of here, by an old man named Silvano. He said if I ever ran across a girl who could make magic from a simple spice pouch, I was to give this to her." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Don Silvano. The memory of the kind old man in the ghost town of Redemption was a warm, distant ember. Elias pulled out a small, flat package wrapped in oilcloth. He told me a long story. Said he knew your mother, long ago. Said he recognized her spirit in you. He asked a cousin of yours, a woman living way down south, to write this down for him to carry. He handed the package to Sarah. Her hands trembled as she took it. She unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal a single sheet of cheap foolscap paper, folded many times. It was yellowed with age, brittle at the creases, and stained with something dark that looked like coffee and something greasy that smelled faintly of lard. But it was the writing that made her stop breathing. The script was a looping, elegant cursive. The ink faded from black to a soft, watery brown. It was her mother's hand. She would know it anywhere. It was a ghost, a touch, a voice from a world she thought was lost forever. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the familiar letters. It was not a letter. It was a recipe. At the top of the page, in her mother's beautiful script, were 2 words, Christmas tamales. It was the recipe Sarah had thought was lost forever, the one her mother had never written down, carrying it instead in her heart and her hands. It was the taste of every happy memory she possessed. Reading the words, a pinch of cinnamon for warmth. Knead the masa until it feels like a baby's skin. Fold the husks like you're swaddling a secret was like hearing her mother's voice whispering in her ear. It was more than a recipe. It was a testament, a legacy, a final, loving instruction passed across the veil of death. That night, she held the fragile paper in her small room, the lamplight tracing the familiar loops and whirls of the script. She knew what she had to do. This was not a meal to be cooked on a whim. This was a ceremony. It was an act of remembrance, an honor she had to pay. The next morning, she began. The work was immense, a departure from the daily stews and roasts. Tamales were a labor of love, a food of celebration and community. The men, seeing her engaged in this strange, all-consuming task, were filled with a wary curiosity. She soaked a massive bag of dried corn husks in a barrel of water. She took the best cut of pork from the larder and began to stew it slowly in a deep pot with a concoction of rehydrated chilies, garlic, onion, and spices from her own pouch. And then came the cinnamon. The recipe called for a single, precious stick to be simmered with the pork. As the warm, sweet, woody aroma began to fill the cookhouse, it was a scent utterly alien to the ranch. It was not the smell of sustenance. It was the smell of something special, something sacred. It mingled with the dark, earthy fire of the chilies, creating a perfume that was complex and deeply comforting. It was the smell of home. She spent hours on the mesa, the corn dough that was the soul of the tamale. She mixed the fine ground corn flour with rich, creamy lard and broth from the stewing pork, whipping it and kneading it with her hands. The recipe said to knead it until it was light and airy, until a small piece floated in a cup of water. It was back-breaking work. Her arms ached, and sweat beaded on her brow. But as her hands worked the dough, she felt her mother's hands working with her. She remembered the feeling of being a small child in the kitchen, her own hands covered in masa, her mother laughing as she guided her. Each knead, each turn of the dough, was a prayer. She was not just mixing ingredients, she was communing with her past, weaving a connection to the long line of women before her who had performed this same loving ritual. By late afternoon, she was ready to assemble. She set up a station at the long table, the bowl of fragrant, dark, shredded pork, the basin of light, fluffy mesa, the pile of softened corn husks. One by one, she took a husk, spread a thin, even layer of mesa on its smooth surface, spooned a line of the rich filling down the center, and then folded it with a series of quick, expert movements, tucking in the sides and folding up the bottom. Each finished tamale, a neat, pale packet, was a secret, a gift waiting to be unwrapped. The men watched her through the open door as they came in from the fields, their curiosity piqued by the all-day preparations and the extraordinary smells. They saw the intensity of her focus, the reverence in her movements. This was not cooking, this was worship. She placed the tamales upright in a massive steamer pot, packing them tightly together. She covered them with a layer of husks and a damp cloth and set them on the stove to steam for hours. When the sun finally set, she was ready. She carried the heavy pot to the table. The men filed in, but the atmosphere was different tonight. There was no rough joking, no weary grumbling. The room was filled with a quiet, expectant reverence. She served them herself, placing 2 of the hot, steaming packets on each man's plate. They looked at the strange, corn husk-wrapped parcels with confusion. "You have to unwrap them," she said softly, her voice the only sound in the room. Awkwardly, their calloused, clumsy fingers fumbled with the husks. They peeled them back to reveal the prize inside a pillow of soft, steaming corn masa, stained red from the rich filling. The aroma that rose from their plates was intoxicating. And then, as they took their first bites, the deepest silence Sarah had ever heard in that room fell. It was a silence that was not empty, but full. It was full of surprise and wonder, and a kind of profound, unspoken understanding. The men, whose palates were accustomed to the simple, blunt flavors of salt and smoke, were experiencing something entirely new. The soft, yielding texture of the mesa, the deep, complex heat of the chili, the impossible warmth of the cinnamon, the tenderness of the slow-cooked pork, it all combined into something that was more than just food. It was a story. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. They were not just eating a meal. They were participating in a ceremony. They were tasting the love of a mother for her daughter, the history of a family, the soul of a culture they had never known. Sarah's eyes scanned the table and came to rest on an old, grizzled ranch hand named Jebediah. He was the most cynical of the lot, a man whose face was set in a permanent scowl and who was known to complain that the coffee was too hot, the biscuits too cold, and the sun too bright. He had been at the ranch for 30 years and had seen cooks come and go. He was, by all accounts, a man impossible to please. Jebediah was examining his half-eaten tamale as if it were a strange new species of insect. He took another slow, deliberate bite. He chewed for a long time, his jaw working, his expression giving nothing away. He swallowed. He stared down at his plate, at the wisps of steam still rising from the mesa. Then, he did something no one had ever seen him do before. He looked across the table, his eyes briefly meeting Sarah's, and he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a barely perceptible movement, but in the silent, reverent cookhouse, it was a thunderclap. It was the ultimate benediction, the highest possible praise from the lowest court of appeal. A quiet warmth spread through Sarah's chest, a feeling of such profound peace and rightness that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She looked around the room at these hard, silent men, their heads bent over their plates, their faces softened in the lamplight. They were eating her memories. They were sharing her mother's love. In that moment, the cookhouse was no longer just a room on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. It was a home. And she, the lost girl from the desert, had filled it with the spirit of all the women who had come before her, a message of warmth and love, spoken not with words, but with the unmistakable, unforgettable scent of cinnamon. The peace was shattered by a scream. It was not a human sound, but the high, terrified shriek of a horse in mortal terror. It sliced through the deep, quiet dark of the moonless night and was followed almost instantly by another, then another. Sarah was jolted from a light sleep, her heart hammering against her ribs before she was even fully awake. She threw open the door of her small room and was met with a scene from hell. The great stable, The proud heart of the ranch's equine operations was on fire. It wasn't just a fire, it was an inferno. Angry orange and yellow flames were already punching through the hayloft window, licking up the dry timbered walls and clawing at the night sky. A thick, roiling column of black smoke billowed upward, carrying with it a blizzard of glowing red embers that danced like demonic fairies on the hot wind. The roar of the blaze was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the structure from the inside out, and woven through it was the constant, panicked screaming of the trapped animals. Men were spilling out of the bunkhouse, shouting and half-dressed, their faces lit with a flickering, horrified glow. They ran toward the fire, then stopped. A disorganized, useless mob, stunned into inaction by the sheer scale and ferocity of the disaster. They pointed, they yelled, but they did not act. Sarah's eyes frantically searched the chaos for a leader, for a center of command. She saw Ignacio Ramirez emerge from the main house. He was already dressed, as if he never truly slept. He strode onto the veranda, his face a grim mask in the firelight. The men turned to him, their faces a mixture of fear and desperate hope, waiting for the orders that would bring sense to this madness. But the orders never came. Ignacio stood frozen at the edge of the porch, his powerful frame rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. His eyes were wide, fixed on the burning stable, but they were not seeing the fire of tonight. They were staring into the past, at the ghost of another fire, another loss, the iron control that defined him, the cold authority that was the bedrock of the ranch, had shattered. The man who commanded an empire of dust and cattle was gone, replaced by a hollow statue, a man paralyzed by a memory so terrible it had stolen his voice and his will. He looked, Sarah thought with a sudden, chilling clarity, like a man who had already died once and was being forced to watch it happen all over again. The men saw it, too. A wave of confusion and fear rippled through them. Their leader was broken. They were rudderless in a sea of fire. It was in that moment of absolute, terrifying vacuum that something inside Sarah shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, cold clarity. She had spent a lifetime surviving. She understood chaos. She understood that when the world was burning down around you, you did not have the luxury of freezing. You acted. Her voice, when she found it, was not loud, but it cut through the panicked shouting with the sharp, clear ring of a blacksmith's hammer. The horses, she yelled, her voice raw but steady. We have to get the horses out. The men turned to look at her, their faces slack with surprise. She was the cook, the quiet woman who lived on the periphery, but her eyes held a fire of their own, a fire of absolute certainty that commanded their attention. Leo Jebediah, she snapped, pointing a trembling but determined finger. Get axes from the woodpile. We need to break down the far corral fence so they have somewhere to run. The rest of you. With me, we need to get those doors open. Her decisiveness broke the spell of their paralysis. Given a direction, an order, their training and discipline kicked in. Leo and Jebediah, the old scowler's face grim with purpose, ran for the woodpile. The other men surged forward with Sarah toward the huge, barred stable doors. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared the skin and stole the breath. The roar of the fire was deafening. Inside, the terrified whinnying of the horses was a sound of pure agony. The main crossbar was blisteringly hot, but two of the strongest men, their face wrapped in bandanas, threw their shoulders against it. With a groan of tortured wood, the bar gave way, and the great doors swung inward, releasing a blast of superheated air and thick, choking smoke. What they saw inside was a vision of chaos. The air was a blinding, stinging fog of smoke and embers. Horses, their eyes wide with terror, crashed against the walls of their stalls, rearing and kicking. The fire was above them, in the hayloft, raining down burning straw like a hellish snow. Get them out, Sarah screamed over the roar, her voice cracking. "Use your shirts to cover their eyes. Lead them, don't just drive them." She plunged in herself, the smoke immediately clawing at her throat. She found a panicked mare, her coat already singed, and tore a strip from her own dress to blindfold the animal. The horse fought her, its powerful muscles trembling. But Sarah spoke to it in a low, steady voice, the same calm tone she'd used to coax a flame in the stove. "Easy now. Easy, girl. We're getting you out, miraculously." The mare quieted enough to be led, and Sarah stumbled out of the inferno, her lungs burning, and released the animal into the yard, where it galloped away toward the now broken fence. She saw Julian working with a silent, focused intensity that matched her own. He moved with his usual grace, even in the chaos, a calming presence among the panicked animals. He was working to free Ignacio's prize stallion, a magnificent black horse that was crazed with fear, kicking its stall door to splinters. The men, led by Sarah's example, worked with a desperate courage. They plunged into the smoke-filled stable again and again, emerging moments later, choking and soot-blackened, leading another terrified animal to safety. But the fire was winning. The roof of the stable was beginning to groan, the massive timbers glowing like charcoal briquettes. "It's going to go," Jebediah yelled, his face black with soot. "The whole thing's coming down." "We have to form a bucket brigade," Sarah commanded, her mind racing. "The bunkhouse will be next if those embers catch pumps start a line to the bunkhouse roof." Once again, her orders created a focus. A line of men formed from the water pump to the bunkhouse, passing sloshing buckets of water hand over hand. They were no longer a mob. They were a team, a single organism fighting for its life. Sarah's eyes darted back to the stable. Most of the horses were out, but not all. The black stallion was still trapped, fighting Julian's every attempt to lead it out. As Julian finally got a rope over the horse's neck, a loud crack echoed above the roar of the fire. A huge, burning crossbeam from the hayloft gave way. Julie and Sarah screamed. The beam crashed down, striking the top of the stall and showering the area with a deadly rain of fire and splinters. Julian threw himself backward, but not fast enough. A heavy, burning piece of timber struck his leg, and he went down with a silent cry of pain, his face contorting in agony. The stallion, finally spooked into action, bolted from the ruined stall and galloped out into the night. For a heartbeat, Sarah's world stopped. She saw Julian on the ground, trying to crawl away from the flames, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Her first instinct was to run to him, to abandon everything else. But she couldn't. If she stopped, the men would stop. The brigade would falter. The entire ranch could be lost. "Leo!" she shrieked, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Help him get him out of there now." Leo and another man ran to Julian, dragging him out of the doorway of the collapsing stable, just as another section of the roof gave way with a deafening crash. They carried him away from the heat, his face pale and slick with sweat in the firelight. Sarah forced herself to turn away from him. She forced down the cold lump of fear in her throat. She had to see this through. She ran to the bucket brigade, her presence and her fierce determination a force that drove the exhausted men on. Faster, get the roof soaked, don't let it catch. They fought for what felt like an eternity, a desperate, losing battle against a merciless enemy. They were losing ground. The side of the bunkhouse was beginning to smolder when the wind, which had been fanning the flames, suddenly shifted. It began to blow from the north, pushing the main force of the heat and the shower of embers away from the other buildings and out into an empty, fallow field. It was the miracle they needed. The reprieve gave them a chance to douse the smoldering bunkhouse wall, to focus their efforts, to finally gain a foothold. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern hills, the fight was over. The stable was a blackened, smoldering skeleton, a jagged wound in the heart of the ranch. But it was the only major loss. The bunkhouse was scorched but standing. The main house was untouched. And, most importantly, Every man and every horse was alive. Sarah stood in the middle of the yard, her dress torn and scorched, her face and arms black with soot. Her body ached with a weariness so profound it felt as though her bones might turn to dust. She looked at the exhausted, smoke-stained men leaning on their buckets, their faces grim, but their eyes holding a new, deep respect as they looked at her. Her gaze drifted past them, to where Julian lay propped against a water trough, his leg crudely splinted, his face tight with pain. He met her eyes, and even through his suffering, he gave her a small, weak smile of gratitude. Then she looked to the veranda. Ignacio Ramirez was still there. He had not moved all night. He stood in the exact same spot, a silent, frozen sentinel watching the destruction of a piece of his kingdom. But as the dawn light touched his face, Sarah saw that something had changed. The vacant, haunted look was gone. His eyes were clear now, and they were fixed on her. He was no longer looking at a ghost from his past. He was looking at the woman who had just saved his ranch. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. The dawn was gray and cold, smelling of wet ash and sorrow. The ruin of the stable stood like a colossal, blackened ribcage against the pale sky, tendrils of smoke still rising from its heart in a final, dying exhalation. The men of Rancho El Mado moved like ghosts in the morning mist, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies slumped with a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The fight was over, but the loss was a fresh, gaping wound in the center of their world. Sarah felt it too, an ache in every muscle, a raw, scraped feeling in her throat from the smoke. But as she looked at the defeated faces of the men, she knew her work was not done. The fire had taken their strength. It was her job to give some of it back. She left the grim tableau of the yard and walked toward the one place that had been spared, her sanctuary, the cookhouse. The room was cold, the great stove a dead, black heart. The first thing she did was clean it out, scooping the old ash from its belly. The methodical, familiar task was a comfort, an act of order in the face of the night's chaos. She built a new fire, her hands moving with a steady, practiced grace. The first crackle of the kindling, the whoosh of the flames catching, was the sound of life returning. She would not make a heavy stew or a hearty roast. Today was not for that. Today was for healing. She found a side of smoked bacon, several onions, potatoes, and a sack of carrots in the pantry. She worked with a quiet, intense focus, the rhythmic chop of her knife on the wooden board a steady, reassuring beat against the silence. Each slice of onion, each cube of potato, was a small act of defiance against the destruction outside. She rendered the bacon in the bottom of her largest cauldron, then added the vegetables, cooking them slowly in the fat until they softened and released their sweetness. She covered it all with water, added a handful of salt and a few peppercorns, and let it simmer. It was a simple, humble soup, the kind a mother would make to soothe a fever. As it cooked, its gentle, savory aroma began to fill the room, a quiet, insistent promise of warmth and comfort. It was a scent that did not demand attention, but offered solace. Her first thought was of Julian. He had been moved to an empty bed in the bunkhouse, his leg, now properly set and splinted by Jebediah, who had a rough knowledge of such things, propped up on a pillow. She ladled a steaming bowl of the soup, added a piece of fresh cornbread on the side, and carried it across the yard. He was awake, his face pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. She set the bowl down on a crate beside his bed and helped him sit up. He took the bowl in his good hand, his fingers trembling slightly from the effort. He didn't try to eat right away. He just held it, breathing in the steam, letting the warmth seep into his cold, tired body. She took a damp cloth and gently wiped the soot from his face. Her touch was light, her movements efficient but tender. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a weary child. No words were needed. In the quiet of the bunkhouse, surrounded by the sleeping forms of other exhausted men, They shared a moment of profound, silent communication. He was her friend, the first she had made in this hard land, and seeing him hurt had struck a deeper fear in her than the fire itself. Her gentle care was her thanks, her relief, her unspoken vow to look after him. He finally took a spoonful of the soup, and a look of simple, profound gratitude washed over his face. She left him to eat in peace and returned to the cookhouse. As she ladled out bowls for the other men who were beginning to stir, the door opened. It was Ignacio Ramirez. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He was clean, his clothes changed, but the night was still in his eyes. He looked older, the iron in his posture somehow more brittle. The men in the room fell silent. Their spoons paused halfway to their mouths. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed on Sarah. He walked into the room, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards. He stopped before her, a few feet away. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the memory of his paralysis and her sudden, shocking command. He looked at the pot of soup, at her soot-stained dress and face, at her hands, which were steady as she held the ladle. She thought he might chastise her for overstepping her bounds, for taking an authority that was not hers to claim. But when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of its usual cold command. "The ranch," he said, and the words seemed to cost him a great deal. It would have been lost. He paused, his jaw working. "You saved it." It was not an absolution or a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the blunt finality of a judge's verdict. He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something flicker in the depths of his dark eyes. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a crack in the ice. It was respect, a profound, grudging, and absolute respect. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. Ignacio Ramirez was not a man who gave thanks. He gave orders. He gave payment. He gave judgments. Thanks was a currency he did not trade in. For him to offer it now, to her, was to admit a debt that could not be paid in coin. He turned without waiting for a reply and strode out of the room, the men parting before him like reeds in a river. Sarah stood frozen, the ladle still in her hand, the quiet weight of his words settling over her. She had just started cleaning up after the noon meal, the men having eaten their soup in a continued, thoughtful silence, when another shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, expecting a ranch hand, but it was Doña Leah. The old woman stood there, her black dress a stark slash against the daylight. But she was not the same woman who had shrieked at her about spices and memories. The fury was gone, replaced by a hollow, ancient weariness. She looked at the ruin of the stable, then her gaze moved to the cookhouse, and finally, to Sarah. She entered the room slowly, her cane tapping a softer, more hesitant rhythm. She did not speak. Her dark eyes swept over the space, but this time there was no scorn in them. She saw the simmering pot of soup on the stove. She breathed in its simple, honest aroma. It was the scent of recovery, of mending. She walked over to the stove and lifted the lid of the cauldron, peering into the gently bubbling broth. She looked at it for a long, long time. "When the old ranch house burned," she said, her voice a dry, papery rustle, "the one that stood before this one, when I was a girl, my mother made this same soup for the survivors." She lowered the lid with a soft clank. She turned to face Sarah. Her face was a web of wrinkles and sorrow, but the hardness was gone, eroded by the night's events. She looked at Sarah, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. She saw not a drifter or a kitchen girl, but a woman who understood the alchemy of food, its power to do more than just fill a stomach. "You cook as if you're feeding ghosts," Leah said. The words were strange, cryptic, but they were not an insult. They were a profound, almost spiritual, observation. It was a recognition from one practitioner of an ancient art to another. Sarah understood. She was feeding ghosts. She was feeding the ghost of Leah's mother. She was feeding the ghost of Ignacio's unspoken past. She was feeding the ghost of her own mother, honoring her with every meal. She was feeding the hungry, wounded spirits of this hard, lonely place. "Sometimes," Sarah replied softly, "the ghosts are the hungriest." A flicker of something, a sad, shared understanding passed between them. Leah gave a single, stiff nod. It was not an apology. It was not an offer of friendship. It was a truce. An acknowledgement that they both belonged to a sisterhood of women who had known loss, and who knew that the only way to fight back against the cold, empty places in the world was with a pot of soup, a warm fire, and a memory of what it felt like to be cared for. The old woman turned and left as quietly as she had come. Sarah stood alone in the cookhouse, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window. Ignacio's thanks. Leah's strange, true words. She felt a profound shift inside her, a settling. She had come to this ranch with nothing but a skillet and a spice pouch, looking for nothing more than survival. She had thought her purpose was simply to stay alive. But now she knew she was wrong. She was not here just to feed hungry bodies. She was here to feed the starved and broken parts of the human soul. She was here to rekindle life. Her eyes fell upon a small, bruised sprig of wild mint lying on her prep table. Julian must have left it for her yesterday, before the fire. She picked it up. She crushed a single leaf between her thumb and forefinger. A bright, clean, vibrant scent burst into the air, the smell of resilience, of new growth. It was the smell of life pushing its way up through the ashes, and in that moment, Sarah knew she was no longer just surviving. She was home. The days after the fire were born of ash and effort. The sun would rise on the silhouette of the ruined stable, and with it would come the sounds of rebuilding. The rhythmic rasp of a two-man saw cutting through fresh timber, the sharp, percussive clang of hammers driving nails, the low murmur of men working together with a quiet, shared purpose. The raw, open wound in the heart of the ranch was slowly, deliberately, being sutured closed. Sarah was the center of this new rhythm, the still point around which the world of the ranch now turned. The men no longer treated her with the careful, suspicious distance of before. The barrier between them had been burned away in the heat of that terrible night. They spoke to her now, not often, and not with many words, for they were not talkative men, but the silence was gone. They would thank her for the coffee, their voices rough with sleep. Jebediah would ask her to save him a piece of the cornbread crust. Leo would tell her they were butchering a steer and ask what cuts she wanted. They were small things, simple words, but they were a profound shift in the social geology of the ranch. She was no longer just the cook. She was Sarah, and she was one of them. Her bond with Julian deepened in the slow, quiet days of his recovery. With his legs splinted and his work limited, he spent much of his time on a bench just outside the cookhouse door, where the sun was warm. He would whittle, his knife moving with a slow, patient grace, or simply watch her as she worked. She brought him his meals, tended to his bandage, and they existed in a comfortable, easy silence that was more intimate than any conversation. He was healing, and as he did, he found small ways to help her. He would peel potatoes with his one good hand, his movements slow but precise. He would sort beans, picking out the small stones with a focused attention to detail. These small, shared tasks were their new language, a quiet domesticity that was a balm to them both. About a week after the fire, as his leg was beginning to mend enough for him to hobble with a crutch, Julian presented her with a gift. He had been gone for most of the morning, a rare venture away from his bench, and he returned carrying a small, live plant in a makeshift pot crafted from a tin can. It was a young chili plant, its leaves a vibrant, healthy green, with two small, nascent peppers already beginning to form. He held it out to her, his gentle brown eyes full of a hopeful, questioning light. It was not a wild, foraged thing, but something cultivated, something meant to last. It was a gift of roots, of permanence. Sarah took the can from him, her fingers brushing his. The warmth of the sun was in the tin, and the leaves of the plant were soft and alive beneath her touch. She looked around the dusty, hard-packed yard. This was a place of horses and cattle, of work and survival. There were no gardens here, no patches of soft earth dedicated to anything other than utility. Then her eyes fell on a small, neglected patch of ground against the south-facing wall of the cookhouse. It was the warmest, sunniest spot in the yard, protected from the wind. It was her wall. Without a word, she carried the plant to the spot. She knelt on the hard ground and began to dig with her bare hands. The earth was dry and compacted, resistant. She fetched a bucket of water from the pump and softened it, then dug again, her fingers pushing through the stubborn soil, clearing away stones and weeds. Julian hobbled over and watched, a silent, supportive presence. She made a small, perfect hole, a welcoming space in the unforgiving land. As she was about to place the chili plant in the earth, she paused. She went back inside the cookhouse and returned with her deerskin pouch. From a hidden pocket deep inside, a pocket she had not opened in years, she took out a tiny, tightly wrapped piece of cloth. She unwrapped it to reveal a small collection of seeds, a few flat, teardrop-shaped cilantro seeds, a scattering of tiny, dark thyme seeds, and 3 small, wrinkled chili seeds of her own, saved from a pepper her mother had grown long ago. They were her emergency store, her seed for a future she had never been sure she would have. She planted Julian's chili plant in the center of the hole. Then, around its base, she pressed her own seeds into the damp, welcoming earth. She was planting his gift of the present alongside her legacy from the past. She was weaving their stories together in the soil. She covered the roots and the seeds gently, patting the earth down with the palms of her hands. The act was so profoundly hopeful, so deeply invested in the idea of a tomorrow, that it made her heart ache. She was putting down roots. Here, in this place, she tended to her small garden with the same devotion she gave her cooking. Every morning and every evening, she brought it water. She protected the young chili plant from the harshest of the afternoon sun with a piece of cheesecloth, and she watched, with a quiet, fierce joy, as the first tiny, green shoots of her cilantro and thyme began to push their way up through the dark soil, reaching for the light. Ignacio Ramirez watched it all. He had changed since the fire. The frozen, haunted look was gone, but it had been replaced by a deep, thoughtful quiet. He was still a man of few words. His presence still commanded an absolute authority, but he was no longer a figure of pure, cold power. He was an observer. Sarah would feel his eyes on her as she worked. He would stand on the veranda of the main house, his arms crossed over his chest, and simply watch. He watched her as she tended her tiny garden. He watched the quiet, easy way she cared for Julian. He watched the subtle but profound change in the demeanor of his men, how they spoke to her with a gruff, protective respect. He saw that the cookhouse was no longer just a functional building. It was the warm, beating heart of his recovering ranch, and he understood that she was the reason for it. He was a practical man, a man who understood assets and foundations. He had built his empire on strong horses and loyal men, but he now saw that he had been missing the most crucial element of all a center, a hearth. One evening, long after the men had eaten and the cookhouse was quiet, he came to her. The room was clean, smelling of soap and wood smoke, and Sarah was sitting at the long table, mending a tear in her apron by the soft light of a single oil lamp. He did not knock. He simply entered and stood by the door, waiting for her to look up. When she did, her eyes were questioning but not afraid. The power dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. He walked to the table and placed a folded piece of paper down in front of her. It was not a recipe. It was a thick, official-looking document, covered in dense, legal script. Sarah looked at it, then back up at him, her expression confused. I had the lawyer in town draw this up, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. It's a deed. It gives you title to this cookhouse and the land it sits on. Half of the business of provisioning the ranch is legally yours. She stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. She had expected wages, perhaps a small bonus for her actions during the fire. She had never, in her wildest imaginings, conceived of this ownership, a stake, a legal, binding tie to this place. She slowly reached out a hand and touched the paper. It was real. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why? Ignacio looked at her, and his dark eyes were clear, steady, and utterly serious. He was not making a charitable gift. He was making a business proposition, the most important one of his life. I watched my first ranch burn to the ground 15 years ago, he said, his voice flat, reciting a fact from a history book. My wife, my son, they were in the house. I was the only one who got out. The confession was stark, stripped of all emotion, which only made it more devastating. It explained the ghost in his eyes, the frozen paralysis, the fortress of ice he had built around his heart. That night, he continued, his gaze unwavering, I stood on that porch and I watched it all happen again, and I did nothing. I was a dead man, watching my own funeral. But you were alive. You ran into the fire. You took command. You held this place together when I could not. He took a step closer to the table. For 15 years, I have run this ranch. I have made it bigger, stronger, more profitable than ever, but it has been hollow. It has been a machine. You have given it a heart. I see the way the men look to you. I see the life you are coaxing from that small patch of dirt outside. I see what you did for Julian. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand flat on the table. Near the deed. It was the gesture of a man laying his cards down, making his final bet. I don't need a cook, Sarah, he said, and his voice was raw with a truth that had taken him 15 years of grief and one night of fire to understand. I have a payroll full of men who can roast a steer. What I need, what this ranch needs, is a partner. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, partner. It was not a word of romance, not a declaration of love. It was a word of shared burdens, of mutual respect, of a future built together, side by side. It was an offer to be the co-monarch of his lonely, dusty kingdom. He was not offering her his heart. He was offering her half of his world. For a man like Ignacio Ramirez, it was the same thing. Sarah looked from his intense, searching face to the legal document on the table, then out the window toward the dark shape of her small garden. She thought of her mother's recipe, a legacy of love. She thought of this deed, a legacy of respect. She thought of the long, lonely road that had brought her here, and the feeling of the soil under her fingernails as she planted her seeds. She had been searching for a place to survive. She had found a place to live. She drew a slow, deep breath, a breath that felt like the first one she had ever taken as a free woman. She looked back at him, her eyes clear and steady, reflecting the lamplight. She had faced down starvation, despair, fire, and fear. She was not afraid of this. Yes, she said. The word was not a whisper. It was a statement, as solid and certain as the iron of her skillet, as enduring as the earth in which she had just planted her future. Yes. The word yes did not hang in the air. It settled. It landed in the quiet cookhouse with the weight and permanence of a foundation stone. It was a word that changed everything, and yet, on the surface, changed nothing at all. The sun still rose the next morning. The men still needed their breakfast. The rhythms of the ranch, for a time, remained the same. But the ground beneath those rhythms had fundamentally shifted. Sarah was no longer a servant on this land. She was a part of it, her future legally and spiritually entwined with its own. The first outward sign of this new reality came not from Ignacio. but from Julian. For weeks, during the slow, patient hours of his mending, he had been working on a piece of smooth, weathered elm wood, a piece salvaged from the wreckage of the stable. He had worked in secret, his knife a silent, tireless servant, and no one knew what he was making. One bright, clear morning, as Sarah was watering the small, thriving garden that was now her pride, he came to her. He was walking without his crutch now, his limp a faint, rhythmic echo of the fire. He held the finished piece of wood in his hands. It was a sign, beautifully carved. The letters were deep and bold, crafted with a loving, meticulous detail. They spelled out 3 words, El Fuego de Maria. Maria, the name on the deed, her given name, the one she had not heard spoken in years, the one she had thought buried with her past. Ignacio had used it on the legal document, a formal acknowledgement of her new station. But to see it carved here, by Julian, was something else entirely. It was an anointing. He had painted the letters in a deep, earthy red, the color of chili and of embers, and above the words, he had carved a single, elegant flame. Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth wood, over the deep grooves of the letters that spelled out her name. Maria's fire. It was perfect. It was the fire in her skillet that had first bought her a chance. It was the fire in her spirit that had saved the ranch. It was the steady, constant fire in the stove that was now the warm, beating heart of this place. Julian, with his silent, profound understanding, had seen it all and given it a name. He gestured toward the cookhouse door, an unspoken question in his eyes. She nodded, her own eyes shimmering with tears she would not let fall. Together, they hung the sign above the doorway. It looked as though it had always been there. Ignacio saw it later that day. He stopped on his way back from the new stable site and stood for a long time in the yard, his head tilted back, just looking at it. He did not smile. He was not a man built for smiling, but a look of deep, quiet satisfaction settled on his face. He looked at Sarah, who was watching from the doorway, and he gave a single, solid nod of approval. The cookhouse was no longer an anonymous building. It now had an identity. It had her name. The next change came from the main house, a quiet tremor from the ranch's long dormant volcano. Doña Leia appeared at the cookhouse door one afternoon, clutching a small, lacquered box. She did not enter, but stood on the threshold, a black-clad emissary between 2 worlds. Her face was still a mask of old sorrows, but the bitter, angry lines around her mouth had softened. "My mother had a recipe," she said, her voice a dry rustle, "for a sheepherder's stew. It is a simple thing, but it is honest." She opened the box and took out a single, folded piece of paper. It was brittle and yellowed, stained with the ghosts of ingredients from a lifetime ago. It looked almost identical to the tamale recipe Sarah's own mother had left her. She held it out. "The men were always fond of it," she said. It was as close to an apology, an offering of peace, as she was capable of giving. It was a surrender of her old territory, a passing of the torch. She was entrusting a piece of her family's soul, her most tender memory, to Sarah's care. Sarah took the fragile paper with gentle hands. "Thank you, Leah," she said softly. "I will take good care of it." Leah nodded, her duty done. As she turned to leave, she paused. "The secret," she added, without looking back, "is a sprig of thyme, bruised just before you add it to the pot. It reminds the meat of the hills." And then she was gone. That evening, Sarah decided the stew would not be cooked by her alone. When the men came in from their work, tired and dusty from a long day of raising new timbers, they found the ingredients for Leah's stew laid out on the long tables: potatoes and carrots, onions and garlic, and a fine cut of mutton Ignacio had provided. "Tonight," Sarah announced to the surprised men, "we all cook together." There was a moment of awkward hesitation. These were men whose hands were built for reins and hammers, not paring knives. But then Jebediah, the old grumbler, shuffled forward. He went to his bunk and returned with a handful of small, lumpy potatoes, their skins still covered in dirt. "Started a small patch behind the bunkhouse," he muttered, almost embarrassed. "Thought we could use 'em." He set them on the table. His offering. That broke the dam. Leo, laughing, began to peel onions, wiping at his eyes with the back of a grimy hand. Two of the younger vaqueros started a clumsy but enthusiastic competition to see who could chop carrots the fastest. And Julian, silent and smiling, sat at the end of the table, carefully bruising a sprig of thyme from Sarah's garden between his thumb and forefinger, just as Leah had instructed. Ignacio stood in the doorway, watching. He did not join in the work, but his presence was a quiet, powerful blessing on the proceedings. He saw his men, who had for years been a collection of solitary, hardened individuals, working together, laughing, their faces softened in the warm lamplight. He saw them becoming a family. They ate the stew together at the long tables, a stew made from their combined efforts. It was simple. As Leah had said, it was honest. And it was the best meal any of them had ever tasted. It tasted of the earth, of shared labor, and of a home rebuilt from ashes. Later, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Sarah stood by her small garden. The chili plant was heavy with ripening fruit, and the cilantro and thyme had grown into a fragrant, verdant patch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. The sounds from the bunkhouse were not of weary silence, but of quiet conversation and the soft strumming of a guitar. In her hand, she held a new wooden spoon. Julian had made it for her. It was carved from the same smooth elm as the sign, and its handle was shaped into a single, elegant, upturned flame. It fit her hand as if it had been grown there. She looked at the warm, glowing light spilling from the cookhouse door, at the proud, dark letters of her new sign, El Fuego de Maria, her fire. It had been a desperate, sputtering spark in the vast, lonely desert. It had been a wild, destructive inferno that had threatened to consume everything. And now, it was this a steady, gentle flame in the hearth, a light that drew people together, a warmth that healed old wounds and nurtured new growth. She thought of the long, hard road that had led her to this exact spot, to this moment. She thought of the hunger, the fear, the loneliness. They were all still a part of her story, the ashes from which she had risen, but they were no longer the whole story. A slow smile spread across her face. It was a smile she barely recognized, a full, easy, gentle thing that came from a place deep inside her that she had long thought barren. It was the first smile in all her memory that was not born of the grim satisfaction of survival. It was born of something far richer, far more profound. It was the smile of a woman who was, at long last, truly and completely, home. It was the smile of belonging. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you are listening from in the world. We love to see how far these tales travel and share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support us, please hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.